Hey there, folks. Welcome to today's episode of the Strategy and Leadership Podcast. My name is Anthony Taylor, and today I'm joined by Bill Hall, who is the president of Simulation Studios. Bill, how's it going today?
Hey, Anthony, I'm doing great, and thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. I'm excited to learn more about the cool work that you do. It's not that I try to avoid people who do strategy because I'm okay that we have competitors because there's enough of space in the market. But what I thought you do is so cool. I thought your experience is so cool and unique. And so I'm really just excited to dish. So maybe you can tell our listeners a little bit about who you are, some of the organizations that you've worked with, and then how did you get into Simulation Studios?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me, as I said before. And yes, competition is a good thing. That means that, there's a need and competitors are not enemies. They're oftentimes friends and complement each other. So very nice to be here and thanks for having me. So Bill, what do I do? What's my background? So background is kind of a little bit unusual, I think, for what a traditional kind of strategy consultant might do. So my background is mostly in high-tech turnarounds. And those turnarounds included the fun, adventurous years at Apple from, 90 to 2003 when, there was a big, huge turnaround, which most people know about. And then from there went on to turn around companies like AOL, Nortel, Skype. So it's been fun. It's been a great ride. And that's actually how I wound up getting into this, because one of the things I learned through doing turnarounds is that you can oftentimes have the world's best strategy, but if you can't get people aligned behind executing that strategy, that's a big challenge. And so interestingly enough, I learned that the best way to kind of get alignment, interestingly, is usually through corporate leadership development. So that's kind of the background and how I got here.
And what do you do now?
So now, as I said, I'm president of Simulation Studios, and kind of the easiest summary on that one is, today's leadership development requirements, they're really tough. They're really complicated. It's this mix of behavior plus strategy plus business, really, really complicated stuff. So Simulation Studios uses business simulations and leader-led development to really increase engagement, relevancy, and really the applicability, which hopefully results in greater employee retention, application, and participant excitement, really around, as I said before, today's incredibly complex requirements.
Cool. So if we go back to the turnaround days, what do you think were some of the ingredients that made them successful? And what do you think when you went in, you say, okay, here's my main focus. Here are the levers that I need to pull in order to move the changes that I want forward?
Yeah, so I'll kind of break that into two pieces. The first part would be, what are the requirements for success? And, most strategies are really good. I mean, assuming that people have taken time and a lot of thought and a lot of energy into writing the strategy. The challenge is they spend a lot of time making those strategies, but not a ton of time really focusing on executing the strategy. How are you going to execute it? What's it going to look like? And that's where both the success and the failure kind of intersect, right? And the successful executions or turnarounds that I've seen spend a lot of time on that execution component. And a big part of that really is making sure that the right people are in the right place. And that's kind of a given. I think most executives know that. But really, do they really understand the what, the why, and the how, what the strategy is, why it's important, and then how they're going to execute it or how they fit into the execution? That really tends to be the key ingredients into a successful turnaround, having people really understand the what, the why, and the how. And that's not easy, but that really is kind of the key three ingredients.
Well, what I find interesting, actually taking the time to move it forward, which on paper seems obvious, but I wonder, and you could tell me from, we talked about experience in youth in the pre-call, but what are those things that why is it harder than it seems? Is it because making the time between the operational strategic? Is it having the conversations when people aren't in the right seats? Or is it that people are focused on the wrong things, or we're resistant to change? If I've been doing this for a long time, I need to move this middle manager over here and they don't like doing this new job. It should be obvious. what are the gaps there? And then
Yep.
how does the work you do now kind of help inform and bridge those gaps?
Yep. So unfortunately, and I know you know this, the answer to that question is yes, all the above. But it's a matter of which pieces, right? But the kind of the epicenter of, at least in my experience, of where I see this kind of, I'll call it go south, just to keep it easy, or go wrong, is at the executive level where these strategies are written. There's a lot of organic knowledge that the people who create the strategy take for granted, or assume that everybody else knows. There's kind of two ways to look at that, right? And that's where the seeds of challenge begin to grow. Because you've lived, the challenges, and because you've lived the planning process of working 3 years in the future or whatever. There's so much that you already understand that you think everybody else does, or you just forget that people don't. That's where all the other things that you talked about begin to kind of come apart. There's a lot of people who don't have that, what I'll call organic knowledge that you have. They may not have the skills to execute what you're talking about, and you as an executive might. So in a sense, there's almost like a bit of a chasm, I guess, between those that create the strategy and those that are expected to execute it. And that's really where it begins to go south. Then all the other things that you talked about, what I'll call are kind of the results of all that, begin to go wrong. Wrong people, wrong people, right place, wrong message, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, that's where it all kind of goes.
Cool. Well, I will ask, well, actually, I'll take away from one of the things I also heard was identifying the pieces, that getting that alignment piece is important. But if you don't identify the pieces that are going all of those yeses, that's kind of like the first step. And one of the things that I've seen is people move so fast trying to fix the problem, they don't identify the problem. And then I made myself a nice little graph, which I don't normally do, which is, this is the chasm of knowledge, which is where TM, where all the information just dies if it doesn't make it down there. But
yeah, it's really true. That's a great way to put it. It really does kind of just disappear. It goes nowhere.
Well, that was your example, TM for you.
Well, yeah, you just made it a nice visual.
There we go. But
better trademark it.
That's what I said. It's all yours now. Can you share an example without giving away any secret sauce of an experience that you were in where, either it went well or it went poorly, and then how did you, resolve it, or, what were the kind of keys?
So this one's so I'll call it kind of esoteric that there's no way anyone could ever connect the dots, because it could almost be any company in the world. So there was one, it was probably a Fortune 10 company, and this is when I was acting as a strategy consultant, not a full-time turnaround person. Okay, so they brought us in because at least they knew that there was a significant knowledge gap. And I mean significant. These 5 leaders of the company, of a huge company, had amazing financial capabilities. I mean, their financial acumen, I would say, were up there with the top professors at the top schools globally. And that's the stuff they loved, right? It was their comfort zone. And they really bet the company, the company's future on aligning people behind this, what I'll call financial strategy. It was entirely financial based. But I think they understood that, there's a bit of a chasm. So they brought us in to utilize simulations to allow people to kind of, what I'll call, get their hands dirty working in these really, really advanced financial theories. And I've got an MBA, and I had to kind of go back and open up the books to go back to the stuff that they really wanted, I guess, considered general knowledge amongst their managers. And I'm talking down to like senior managers, not even like just simple level like director or above, and complicated stuff. So they figured, let's bring in a sim and train thousands of people on these really advanced financial theories. It was a good idea. At least they understood the chasm was there. But their knowledge was so advanced that trying to bridge that chasm was really, really hard. I mean, we're talking about a major engineering feat of a bridge in a sense. So that's one that I wanted to bring up, because their intentions were in the right place and their knowledge that there was a chasm was in the right place. But where they kind of fell short was getting people up to speed at that level was pretty much impossible. A lot of people gained a lot of great knowledge and learned a great kind of level of leadership, because they combined it with financial acumen plus leadership. And leadership stuff was great. The financial stuff kind of fell short. And that CEO ended up being replaced about 2 years later.
Got that.
Yeah.
What I find interesting, thank you for sharing that. What I
Mhm.
find interesting about it is it's not the lack of smarts that'll get
Right.
you. Uh,
Exactly. It's so spot on. Right.
and these are arguably, incredibly smart people, but
Yep.
it's we call it the curse of knowledge. And when I walk into sessions and I talk to people about their like mission, and they're like, yeah, you know it at the most intellectual level. And I joke and I say, you have to assume people are potatoes. Like, will they understand that thing you're trying to communicate to them,
Yep.
so that you can get them to, they can't understand the strategy, they can't do the strategy.
Yeah, it's really true. I mean, it kind of goes back to what I was saying about, when you live in this stuff, it's just such common knowledge to you. It's like us, I'll call breathing, just as an extreme example, a dramatic example. To them, this stuff's simple, but they kind of forget that it's, not so simple for everybody.
Yeah.
And that's really kind of, and it's funny because okay, let me back up. I've been fully guilty of this. So that's an important point here, right? Where, there was one of the companies that had this great marketing strategy in theory. I guess it was great. I don't know. But anyway, and trying to get people on board, and I've miserably failed. And I have no problems admitting, when things haven't gone great. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And that's really where that is exactly where I learned how I need to give people hands-on experience living a day as me 5 years from now to be able to get to where I need to go 5 years from now. And that's where that was kind of the epicenter of the, or genesis, we'll get fancy, the genesis of the idea of, hey, if I can kind of help people avoid the mistakes I've made, then I will go to bed happy at night.
No, that's awesome. Well, it's always cool to hear the genesis of an idea.
Yeah,
One of the
right.
things, and I want to ask you about the sim work, is if people can't see a future, there's no way they're going to act on it.
That's exactly right.
So it's one of the reasons we say, like, hey, don't do a 5-year vision, because most people can't think that far. But what I really loved is you're like, okay, I need to put people like into the future state, and we use imagination. But dang, if you could like put like a VR headset and say, hey, this is what our company is going to be at $1 billion, like experience 30 people reporting to you. But tell me, what does the sim software do? What does it look like? And what are some lessons from it that our listeners can take that maybe they can apply today, short of that technology?
Yeah. So to kind of emphasize what you just said, it really gets back to the what, the why, and the how. What we're doing, why we're doing, how we're doing. People can live that great, right? Because then they know where they're going. So you're absolutely spot on with that. Now, sims. Simulation, to back up a quick second, is a really fancy word for game, right? I mean, it really is. And so what I do is I create business games that let people experience that, the what, the why, and the how. Now, they don't need to be fancy. And I wrote a book about utilizing games and learning, and it's called Shift Using Business Simulations in Serious Games. And it's a cheap, easy read on Amazon. It only takes a couple hours to read. It's nothing fancy. And a big kind of thesis of that book is, you don't want to make them big, because then it just becomes about the sim itself. And that's pointless, right? That's just like web designers impressing web designers with fancy websites. You don't need to do that. So the average person, especially if they're in the training and development division, they can create a sim. I mean, some of the best sims I've written sims for other very, very, very large leadership development companies. And we are both fans of paper-based sims. They don't need to necessarily be digital. The digital ones are great. Sometimes paper, you just outgrow it, and that's the way it is. But having, and I'll describe paper. Paper might be a very short case study that has a sim component, which is you're simulating something that's going on in your business, and then adding tools, something as simple as like, I don't know, Google, what's it called? The surveys, right? You've got a sim where that Google survey is attached to the paper-based sim. You combine the two, and you have multiple rounds of discussion and input and discussion. You kind of, look and see what the decisions were, learn from the mistakes, and apply that back to more rounds, you've got a sim. They really don't need to be complicated. And as I said before, the complicated ones can be problematic.
Can you
So
give me
there's
an
all
example of
sorts of
what
ways to
that's
do
what
this.
the sim would be? Because I think I understood it that you're using the form to source information, but what
Right.
is this sim? Is it like a case study? Like, okay, this thing happens if this,
Mhm.
then that kind of thing? Or
Yeah, so let me give you a really clear, tangible example of a paper-based sim that's incredibly easy to make. So they're called branching stories. You ever heard of branching stories?
I
Yeah.
think so.
Yeah, so I'll remind you. I'm sure you're gonna go, oh yeah, I remember that, because there was kind of a day where there were these like adventure books. You could choose your adventure. Yeah, so that's a branching story. It's a fancy term for choose your adventure book. So you make one of those about your company. So let's say your company has um, a real challenge with, I don't know, leading the organization as opposed to leading just self. Okay, so you make a really brief, like a page case study about that. And at the end, give them 4 choices, A, B, C, D. Okay. And they select one of those choices, and it takes them to another really quick, like half page, 1 page case that's based off the decisions that they made before. And you can do all this using SurveyMonkey, Google Survey, there's all sorts of survey companies that do this, right? So based on one answer, it takes you somewhere else. And then at the end of that, you get a score. Okay. Everyone's going to have different scores. And the trick is you make it team based. So you say you take 25 people, break them up into teams. Each of them do that sim, because a branching story is a sim. And then they all compare scores and they all talk about it. What happened? What they learn? Why, we're all from the same company. Why are we in different places? Why do we have different scores? What's the interpretation? What does all this mean? That's a sim. Is that a concrete example?
Yes, absolutely. So
Yep.
my first university class ever was Introduction to Logic. It was a second year course, and I failed it spectacularly, as I did with many of my
Which means you
things,
learn the most.
which is I learned a lot, but I actually really like it because I like
Yeah.
math, and math is uh, generally you can predict it if you
Yeah.
understand how
Right.
it works. And
Right.
so basically, as a manager and as a leader, what I'm taking away from this, by the way, I love it, and I think people should check you out and do that after. But
Right.
the idea of conditional logic, if
Right.
this, then that.
Then that.
If I fire an employee right now, what happens? If I keep the employee right now, what happens? And it sounds like a sim basically says, you have an underperforming employee, or you have a high performing employee, but he's super toxic to the culture. What do you
Yep.
do? If
Yep.
this, then that, and then
Yep.
follow that through, but in a
Right.
safe environment where
Right.
leadership teams can have conversations around the if thens, what's, how, why, about how it might impact the strategy. Do I
Yeah,
get that?
exactly. Now we don't,
And in a
once in a
fun
while
way.
we'll do one as simple as like the branching story. The kind of the standard sim, we write them custom, but I'm not really a huge fan of the custom. I think most of the time you can get away with a ready to go, but happy to write a custom because it's an intellectual challenge. Um, the standard kind of sim that we write might have anywhere 80 to 110,000 equations in it. So they're a lot bigger than the branching story. But
Yeah.
you don't always need those. I'm going to emphasize this again, unless you've got really complex, situations. You just you shouldn't go there unless you absolutely have to, because it'll get in the way of the learning.
What obviously don't over engineer something,
Yes.
but what are your favorite sims to run with leadership teams? And if that
Mm,
person is listening, like, who's your ideal person to work with, who you could help
right.
the most? I'm happy to give that plug to.
That's very nice of you. Thank you. So, my favorite sims are going to fall into the emerging leader slash hypo leadership development participant. I'll kind of go for the participant level. And the reason why is they're so excited to be there. They're so excited to learn, and they're really enthusiastic about growing in the organization compared to when I do like an exec sim. They're kind of like, I know everything, and what are you going to teach me? It's a very different kind of approach until they start using the sim and they realize they're getting slapped around by the sim.
Their asses kicked. Yeah.
Yeah, basically, exactly. That's exactly what I was thinking. So that was part one. Oh, and then in terms of who I usually work with, I really prefer working with, in most cases, it's going to be the director of leadership development inside of a company. Like if an exec comes to me, say a chief operating officer or something, I'll say, great, looking forward to working with you. But can we include, I'll first go to the chief learning officer, and then usually try to squirrel my way down to the director of leadership development, because that's where the rubber meets the road, right? This is where we intersect between strategy and people. And it happens in leadership development. It is truly the best place to put these things. If they go outside of that, that's usually where they fail.
Cool. I got that. I can try to do a quick 2-minute summary of
All
our
right.
conversations. Okay. So
Sure.
one of the things I'm taking away from this, in addition to kind of traditional strategy exercises, here's where we're going, here's why we want to go there, here's what we need to do, being able to use various simulation exercises, provide an immersive experience for people to get their hands dirty, but also to get ahead of any potential changes so that they can think outside of what they know while also experiencing a level of feedback for certain decisions such that they can kind of battle test their XYZ opportunity as they move forward through that strategy without having fundamentally taken a step, so that whether you're a senior executive who doesn't know what they don't know and might assume they know how the path is going to go, or somebody kind of earlier stage of the journey who knows they don't know what they don't know, that both of those groups can really like hone in on and get ahead of some of the important decisions they may have to make, such that it can add resiliency and fun to strategy execution.
You're a quick learn. It's very rare. Usually I have to spend a few days teaching people what these are because they're niche, right? So yeah, you nailed it.
So I think it's super cool. I think why it's important as a consultant, as somebody who works with a lot of teams, is people don't have those opportunities. And for a lot of people, those opportunities are very costly. And so to be able, and in like a dynamic, high change world, I think being able to go through something like that is breaks through the like clutter of like, let's read this book and do a book report on it. But just like helps in a fun way to like help bring faster minds and develop leadership. So I think it's really cool what you're doing, Bill. And I'm just grateful we got to chat. I would love to see more of it, but where can our listeners, viewers connect with you? Where can they learn more about what you do and potentially get engaged if they want to work together?
Sure. So again, can't thank you enough for having me. It's been a lot of fun. So simulationstudios.com, nice and easy. Kind of another division is strategic mindsets, plural.com. It's a division that does the ready to go stuff. And then, yeah, those are the two best places to go. That's where you can get the most info. I have lots of posting. You can do a search for Bill Hall, Forbes, lots of articles, because I love writing. But again, thanks for having me.
Awesome. It's my pleasure. And folks, as you think about it, if you're visualizing the, what do we call it? Chasm of knowledge, TM, trademark Bill Hall.
Yeah.
Just, there's an easy way, easy air quotes, a simple way to bridge that to help your teams make better decisions in an uncertain time. And so I encourage you to, whether it's going through a simulation like this, challenge your people to get outside of what they think they know to help them not only make better decisions, to be more prepared, because nobody likes to suck and nobody likes to fail. So what can you put in place to help them be more successful? And Bill, it sounds like you're doing that for some of the greatest organizations that we have around. So it's cool to hear. It's cool to see. And it's been a pleasure chatting with you.
All right. Thanks much, Anthony.
Folks, this has been the episode of the Strategy and Leadership Podcast. I want to thank Bill Hall, my guest today. Be sure to connect with him. Be sure to challenge your leadership team. And don't assume that everybody has what they need to cross that chasm of knowledge, because otherwise, pulling them out of there will be probably way more expensive than building a ladder or a bridge across. So thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. This has been the Strategy and Leadership Podcast. My name is Anthony Taylor. See you next time.